Excellent. So we'll restart that then. So you're all very welcome to join us. My name's Joe Walsh. I'm the Development Officer with the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project, and this is our monthly history club. And we're delighted to welcome Ash Caulfield, who will be presenting on Northern Ireland's trans history. And we're delighted to have you, Ash. Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Right. Um, Anything coming through okay? Okay, so my presentation is titled Phone Line Collapse, but the calls kept coming in. The lived experiences of trans and gender non-conforming people in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. A bit wordy, but gets the point across. So just a quick introduction. My name is Ash Caulfield. I'm a recent graduate of Queen's, where I studied history and politics. My dissertation focused on the experiences of trans and gender non-conforming people here in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. I took its beginning with the Battle of the Bogside in 1969 and ending with the peace agreement in 1998. I chose to focus on this as Northern Irish LGBT research often doesn't specifically look at trans experiences, and British and Irish trans research often ignores Northern Ireland. And this research was done through a mix of oral history interviewing, of just talking to people who lived at the time, and archival resources, most of which I got through Proning. Just a quick note on terminology. The terminology of the time is used throughout. So many of these terms are no longer in use, or some people would consider offensive. But I chose to use these, as many other historians do, as by ignoring them, this erases the experiences of those in the past. And on screen, you should be able to see the definitions that I took for transvestite and transsexual, which were taken from a international transvestite transsexual journal at the time. This takes a transvestite as a person who derives satisfaction from wearing the clothing of the opposite sex, and a transsexual as a person who feels their physical gender does not match the way that they feel inside. And at the time, these terms were often abbreviated to TV and TS, and I do that throughout the presentation. So the research and presentation are separated into three distinct themes: transition, discrimination, and community. So beginning with transition and experiences of transness itself.
Okay, so throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, there were a lot of changing definitions. Transvestite in particular saw a lot of change throughout this time. In the early days of the 1970s, it typically would have been used to refer to men who enjoyed wearing women's underwear, particularly while having sex or masturbating. But then by the early 1990s, it was used to distinguish between those who simply enjoyed wearing the clothes of the opposite sex, and those who were seeking out surgery and hormone replacement therapy, who throughout the time were referred to as transsexuals, and now would be simply referred to as trans or transgender. And as is the case nowadays, transvestites and transsexuals came from a wide variety of backgrounds. You had teens who were still living with their parents, British soldiers who were stationed here during the Troubles, and those from more rural areas or farming backgrounds, as well as otherwise happily married men. And what I don't go into in this, but I did also observe in my research, is that there was a marked absence of evidence of trans men or of women transvestites. Um, but that's something that needs a lot more research. I did some theorizing on it, but it's something that needs a lot more research and focus. Um, but worth noting in any case. So the realizations of transness came in many forms. Some experienced a compulsive urge to wear female or male dress as a child, while others had the realization after, dressing up in women's or men's clothes as a joke or as a dare, especially in, late teens or early 20s, kind of being egged on by friends. Gender nonconformity more broadly was also evident at this time in gay men, lesbians, drag artists, and even at the time was linked to transness, with parallels being drawn with those hermaphrodites, which was parodied in local journals at the time. Access to clothing, which was very important for both transvestites and transsexuals, as it would allow them to feel most at home in their body and their presentation. This was at the time primarily via mail order or borrowing from family members, taking their clothes while a wife or sister or mother was out of the house. Though there was one TBTS boutique for a period of about 6 months. It was on the Lisburn Road. It was called Transformations, and they sold kind of everything that a trans person at the time would need. Various clothing, magazines, false breasts were how newspapers described it. But it eventually had to close due to death threats made to staff by an unnamed paramilitary organization. Um, then So in terms of gender affirming care, transsexuals typically would have been sent to Windsor House, which was the psychiatric unit hospital. And here they would have been assessed whether they needed to transition for the good of their health. Oftentimes, transsexuals would then be expected to spend a further 2 years presenting woman or man before, and oftentimes before they could even access HRT. As this and subsequent refusals to be prescribed HRT, many transsexuals resorted to seeking it out from other sources, which is known as DIY, and unfortunately is still what many people have to resort to. To receive surgery, transsexuals had to travel to England, and oftentimes this was after waiting years or decades and just being put off and put off. So as well as, the cost of the surgery, which sometimes is covered by the NHS, and you also had to think of travel. The commission is looking at discrimination against. So the only exposure that many people to transsexuals were in media, which was not the most sympathetic to trans people. Many individual private people were hounded by tabloids, and journalists and photographers would be deceitful. And although they would claim to be to help them, they would actively be making things worse by publicizing, private individuals' full names, places of work, about their, and it caused a lot of grief for many people. The vocal minority within the broader general public made their views about transsexuals known in many ways. Families often treated trans children or spouses, be that verbal abuse, physical abuse, or kicking them out of their home. Trans people also endured verbal and physical abuse on the streets. Then there was a marked complicated relationship that I observed between gay, lesbian, and bisexual people and trans people. So in terms of lesbians, while many trans folks community with lesbians, others were treated in feminist circles at the time. Trans people were often viewed as Trojan horses of the patriarchy or as a sexist caricature, with the assumption being that they were dressing up in this way to make fun of women, which led to a lot of people isolated from the lesbian community. I mean, gay men refute the existence of gay transvestites and girls, which left many feeling isolated or as if they were somehow broken. And especially following the affair, which was a boys' home where young boys were unfortunately being sexually abused by men who were supposed to be caring for them. Following that, publicized and talked about, a lot of in the community were concerned that trans people reflect poorly on more respectable gay men or lesbians, casting trans people as somehow deviant, and just further isolated trans people from the community that they should have been at home in. Another major issue was militarized anti-trans prejudice. Both the RUC and British Army heavily targeted trans people, particularly at checkpoints. Trans people would be subject to being, checked multiple times, having to strip, having to show multiple forms of ID. And while this was in part because, members of state forces were wary of them, since paramilitaries would dress as women to try to avoid search of the checkpoints. A lot of the time, this was just unfair targeting. Also, as previously touched on within medicine, many trans people were very much mistreated by their doctors and just denied medical care. One narrator, one of the people that I interviewed, remarked to me that Windsor House preferred to look after perverts coming out of the jails or who were in the jails than transgender people, which says it all, I think. And the final section is just looking at the community and solidarity that trans people find with each other and with other people. So although there weren't really any beforehand, a lot of LGBT organizations popped up in Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles. The first trans-specific group that I was able to locate was the Transvestite Action Organization, which was first recorded in late 1974. TAO possibly could have been an Irish chapter of an American organization, which have a similar ethos and had the same name, but since there was so little documentation of it and no one alive really seemed to remember it, at least that I asked about, I wasn't able to verify this. There was also Transvestites Anonymous, which was also known as the Irish Transvestite Organization. This operated out of a private house in Ballygowan, which belonged to someone who was high up within the Union for Sexual Freedoms Ireland. Presumably, he was sympathetic or, felt that he empathized with the struggles of trans people and allowed them to use his house as a meeting place for their more informal meetings. This group is also aligned with the Samaritans. Cara Friend didn't specifically cater for trans people, but were a massive help and probably the biggest help to trans people in Northern Ireland at the time. They initially just directed people to these smaller independent groups, but eventually in 1977, Will McCreath, who was a trans bus driver and the subject of a recent play during last year's Outburst Queer Arts Festival, she approached them and express interest in setting up a helpline for transvestite and transsexual people alongside the standard helpline that Cara Friend had. And around the same time, an in-person group for trans people within Cara Friend was founded. And while it struggled with attendance, it still provided a safe space for many people to explore their identities and dress in preferred clothing and just get to interact with other trans people in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have. Though due to the aforementioned issues of respectability politics and some people having lesser opinions of gay transvestites, not everyone felt welcome at the group. For the early 90s, the group was replaced by the Belfast Butterfly Club, which is still functioning today. The Butterfly Club functioned much the same as the Cara Friend TBTS group, and it was on sure footing and very well established by 1992. So the Butterfly Club at the time suffered some of the same issues of respectability politics, leading some people to feel unwelcome. And an annual and weekly fee also acted as a barrier for some people. These organizations, while they were by no means perfect, were completely essential and irreplaceable for trans people at the time. Community was also found outside of these organizations, and it really helped to provide a broader support network for trans people. Some trans folks had friends who would help them to buy clothes or give them a place to sleep if they were rejected by family, kicked out of their house. Others found community within activism and pride parades, which provided both a sense of solidarity and a source of joy, kind of providing a space to laugh back in the faces of oppressors. And although public opinion towards trans people wasn't the kindest, there were good people out there, with strangers often, not often, but sometimes standing up against transphobia and just that they encountered in their day-to-day lives. In one instance, a trans client was referred to Cara Friend by a reverend of some church establishment, is how it was described in a report, which just kind of shows that this solidarity came from a lot of unexpected places. So just to conclude, and some final thoughts. The years following the Troubles saw the treatment of trans people improve in Northern Ireland, with discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment being banned in 1999. Legislation was brought in at the time. In more recent years, however, as I'm sure you're aware, the rights of trans people have been slowly eroded across the world. They've been debated and, in many cases, completely disregarded, especially in the United States and in the UK. As such, this research, I feel, is very timely, highlights the importance of solidarity for our community. And the photo there is from London Trans Pride, which I attended at the weekend, unfortunately having to miss Belfast Pride. And yeah, as mentioned, this was a great space for feeling solidarity with other trans people in a really difficult time. So overall, just kind of thoughts, pulling everything together. It wasn't easy to be trans anywhere, by any means at the time, but Northern Ireland was a particularly difficult place for trans people during troubles, as it was for many people. It was almost impossible for many to access hormone replacement therapy or gender affirming surgery. There was the widespread discrimination that they faced was fueled by an often unsympathetic media and was often hidden or by the ongoing conflict. Any violence was just disregarded as being linked to that and not, anything else. But solidarity and community allowed for survival of our community. So despite the ongoing conflict and the discrimination they faced, trans people in Northern Ireland during the Troubles found and founded community, creating spaces in which they could truly be themselves, for many, perhaps for the first time. And yeah, that's it. I just have a list of my sources at the end, anything that I quoted. And also, if anyone has any further queries, those are the places that you can contact me, especially if you are interested in any of the sources that I mentioned or any further research. Yeah, thank you so much again for having me, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic, Ash. That was really, really interesting. And hopefully, we'll have a few questions here from people. Just to remind
Mhm.
you, we are still recording, but we will have further questions after the recording ends for people who don't want to be part of that. But if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either type it into the chat or unmute your device. Okay, any questions? Okay, just while we're waiting on questions to come through, Ash, one thing I
Mhm.
noticed was that transvestites were included under the trans umbrella from early
Yeah.
days, from the start. I thought that was a recent thing with, I thought that was something that Stonewall had done policy-wise, but you have evidence that it's always kind of been that way. Yep,
Yeah, definitely, at least in Northern Ireland, and there was evidence of it internationally as well. I looked at a lot of journals written by and for trans people, and a lot of them were both transvestites and transsexuals. Obviously, plenty of differences between the two categories, but definitely here they found a lot of their community together. Yeah.
excellent. And we have a question in the chat that says, Ash, I was wondering what discovery most surprised you in your research?
Um, I couldn't think of any single discovery that would really got me because kind of everything in my research was a new discovery because no one else that is published has really done this research before. Um, so everything, I know it's kind of a cop out of an answer, but everything was very new and very exciting. Um, I think probably especially seeing the evidence of so many different organizations and how they all kind of came together to provide support to trans people. That wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was definitely one of the nicest things that I came across, which is seeing that that community and solidarity kind of has always been there since a more solid LGBT community as a whole emerged here.
Excellent. Thank you, Ash. And early days, the research, there was no mention of non-binary people.
Yeah, no, those kind of terms wouldn't have been used until into the 21st century. There definitely would have been individuals that, looking back now with a modern lens, that we could ascribe that label to, but it definitely didn't exist at the time. I think the kind of closest would have been transvestite because they would have been more so playing with their presentation. So I'm saying that there are many non-binary people who do medically transition. It's just kind of different terms, categories within different times, I think.
Yeah, thank
Yes, I was surprised that the the preparation time wearing female clothes lasts as long as 3 years, but that's quite a long period of time. I never actually knew what the period of time was, but 3 years is obviously quite a lot. It
Yeah,
would have been it would have been difficult for Wilma in those 3 years, such a long period of time.
yeah,
Uh,
no, definitely, and that's still an ongoing issue for many people seeking like a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to be able to access healthcare. within the UK, being expected to, without any surgery or hormones, present as the gender that you actually are, can be much more difficult, and putting yourself honestly at much more risk of experiencing transphobia if someone realizes you're trans, and that's just as true now as it was then. Like I, from interviewing people who knew trans folks at the time, it was a major source of stress for people. Just I've waited so long to get this appointment, and now they're expecting me to wait even longer before I'm gonna get access to the surgery that I need. And yeah, it's an awful system.
Thanks, Ash.